Let's talk.
Giles Brown.
The Cancelled Prime Minister, The Extraordinary Rise and Tragic Fall of Ramsay MacDonald, is a new book by Walter Reid looking about how the first working class partition to reach Britain's highest office was brought down and then his legacy disappeared. It is a fascinating new biography. I'm delighted to say that the author of The Cancelled Prime Minister, Walter Reid, joins me now. Walter, good morning to you.
Good morning to you. Thank you for having me.
The pleasure is mine. I was thinking about Ramsay MacDonald, and there seems to be a rather large hole in my history when it comes to naming prime ministers. And I think this is we talk about cancel culture, which is one that upsets everybody these days. But you can argue that Ramsay MacDonald has been cancelled and has been erased and pretty much forgotten, because in the years since he was Prime Minister of the UK. Explain a little bit about, if you can, because this seems a fascinating story. A working class Prime Minister.
Well, I'm glad you think so. I think so. There are two things about Ramsay MacDonald which make him unique. One is that he was the first Labour Prime Minister that Britain had. He left school at the age of 14. He was the illegitimate son of an itinerant ploughman and a farm worker. His mother, Annie, earned about £8 a year plus her keep. And her father, as a ploughman, earned about £20 and another £20 in kind. So he came from just about as poor as you could be in Victorian still Britain, and he ends up as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the friend of the Emperor, the King Emperor George V, probably George V's closest Prime Minister. He's on the world stage with aristocrats and people from the most rarefied backgrounds, and here he is. He left school at 14. His first job was working in the fields as his father had done, and he might well have ended up as a forgotten figure in the same way as his father is forgotten. He was asked to come back to school to be a student teacher to help the headmaster in the little village school that he went to. And that couple of years he spent as a student teacher, that was enough to open his sights to grander ambitions. And although, as I say, he left a village school at the age of 14, a village school in Scotland at that time was a fairly rigorous place. He was trained in Latin and Greek and Euclid, and if he had more money, he would have gone to university, but he didn't. He came to London, and we can talk later perhaps about what he did when he got there, but the second thing about Ramsay MacDonald that makes him unique is that he became Prime Minister for the first time in 1924, a minority Labour government, which the other parties allowed in the hope, I think, that it would go belly up and that would be the end of the Labour movement. But it did quite well. He couldn't last for long as a minority, but he was in office for a few months, did quite well. And 5 years later, he was back as Prime Minister with a powerful party behind him. So he becomes Prime Minister again in 1929. By 1931, there's an enormous economic crisis, and Britain is without assets. By August 1931, we've got 4 days' money left in the Bank of England to run the country on. In response to pleas, particularly from his friend, the King, George V, MacDonald takes over as leader of a national government, dominated by the Conservatives, Labour Party in a fairly weak position in it, Liberal Party even weaker. And this was seen as the great abandonment of the Labour movement. People made allegations about betrayal, that he'd done it all to promote his position in society, this sort of thing. Even some said that the whole process of building up a Labour movement was all designed so that he could finally destroy it. All nonsense, of course, but the Labour Party never forgave him. And now he's effectively written out of the Politburo photographs, so to speak, of the Labour Party. The Labour, if he's ever mentioned by Labour politicians, it's by way of recrimination. Neil McKinnon was called Neil MacDonald at one point, as just to hint that he was perhaps betraying the party in the same way as MacDonald had. Totally unfair. We can talk about that if you want, but it was an unfair fate for a very great man.
Because to call Neil McKinnock, Neil MacDonald. I mean, that's a slur. That's a slur. And obviously, it's something that is it's a wound that is deep in the Labour Party DNA. Then
it is indeed. Little anecdote that demonstrate that when the local council in MacDonald's town of Lossiemouth wanted to create a facsimile of his study, they asked the Labour Party for some memorabilia to furnish it with, and the Labour Party wouldn't even answer the letter. They didn't do anything. So they turned to the Conservatives, and the Conservative MP for Lossiemouth approached the Conservative Speaker of the House of Commons, Bernard Weatherall, and Weatherall said, we've got to do something for MacDonald, and they printed off a facsimile of his maiden speech and gave it to the museum. So even then, 70-odd years after he died, the Labour Party wanted nothing to do with him or his memory.
What was also extraordinary is, the background. I mean, he is basically an illegitimate child, and this is not sort of 2020. This is basically the Victorian era. So there's a huge social
stigma. I keep mentioning his friendship with George V because it's very important. In fact, it was that friendship and his feeling of responsibility and duty to the king that led him to take the leadership of this Conservative-dominated national government. He didn't really want to do that. He saw exactly how history would see him, but he did it for the benefit of the king. Now, that king, when he ascended to the throne, he produced some rules of protocol for his court. And one of the rules was that even the so-called innocent party, as it was called in those days, the innocent party to a divorce action, wouldn't be received at court. Well, here was MacDonald, an illegitimate son of an adulterous union. I mean, it must have been incredibly difficult for him. And he was conscious of this. He was slightly embarrassed about the fact that he was illegitimate. And a Tory rag called John Bull, a periodical, got hold of the fact that he was illegitimate, and that in fact his name wasn't Ramsay MacDonald at all. That was his middle name. He was very hurt by this. They published his birth certificate, and he was very upset by this, and he always felt at a disadvantage. And no wonder, because as you say, Giles, it was a very, very different society we're talking about. There have been lots of prime ministers who are total bastards in one sense, but not perhaps in this sense.
Not perhaps in the actual literal meaning of the word, the proper meaning of the word. And then there's that, and then there's a social structure which is stifling. And so for him to rise from that, again, not only is he legitimate, but he comes from, one step above poverty. I mean, he sees considerable deprivation. Even it's not a Constable painting, is it? The life that he's born into. It's not all sort of squires and beautiful.
No, you can still see the cottage he was brought up in as a young boy. It was a very small cottage, and eventually, when he was married and he had whatever it was, 4 or 5 children, he and his wife built a house in Lossiemouth for themselves. It looks from the outside rather grander than it is, but it's a fairly small house. But he wasn't allowed to build it where he wanted in the most desirable part of Lossiemouth. He was told, bastards don't live here.
Wow.
so he lived in this house. And interestingly, this house belonged to his family, has always belonged to his family since he built it. And his granddaughter, a lovely lady called Iona Keelhorn, owns it now and has maintained it almost as it was in his time. And if Iona is kind enough to invite you in, because it's a private house,
yeah,
the rooms are as they were in his time, and you can imagine him coming in from the garden or going to his bedroom. By then, his wife died in the year they built the house. And that was one of the tragedies of MacDonald's life. He never got over her death. Died in 1910. He died in 1934. Never got over her death. And so he had a bachelor bedroom, and it's incredibly Spartan. A single metal bedstead, very sparely furnished room. It was a very strange ascetic life he lived for the rest of his life, always aware of the presence of Margaret, his wife, and his little boy who died of diphtheria at the age of 5. So he was a strange man, and what I've tried to do, particularly in the book, because the facts of his life are fairly well known, what I've tried to do really is to get inside the man. He wrote enormous volumes of diaries, which he said he never wanted published because there were raw thoughts that he wrote down at the end of each day. And if you read them and go through them as I've done, you get to the heart of a very strange, lonely, self-sufficient man.
What's his? Because again, at this point, we talked about the social structure, but is there a faith? Because obviously, religion in Scotland, for those who are south of the border, can be a very confusing issue, and it can be. There is a man who this is a man at the turn of the century. He's joined the Socialist Party. Others are finding Bolshevism or whatever, and wanting to turn the whole society structure on its head and the religious structure on its head. You mentioned him being a sort of a man living a Spartan life. Is there religion in his life? Does he, does that play a part?
Yeah. Religion was very important to him as a young boy. As you say, Giles, in those days, religion, particularly in Scotland, was a central feature of life. And he was certainly brought up in a very religious background. He always had faith in a God, but I don't think it was precisely a Christian religion. He was a man of faith. He thought there was something beyond the material life of every day. And in his youth, he belonged to almost every socialist or quasi-socialist organization there was. But at the end of the day, and this is part of the key to why he was able to quote-unquote abandon the Labour Party, he wasn't wedded to Labour or to socialism, certainly not to Marxism or anything like that. He believed in what's been called an incremental utopianism. And by that he meant a practical, pragmatic approach to try to improve the life of ordinary people. It wasn't doctrinaire. It wasn't remotely doctrinaire. It was practical, and there was room for compromise. And that compromise is at the centre of what he did in 1931.
You see, then here is the rub, of course, because he could be very easy to be a firebrand, and make the things that let's throw the system. And yet, as you mentioned, he has this very close relationship, a working relationship with the king emperor, in fact. And it would be very easy to him to stand on a soapbox and say, down with all monarchists, line them all against the wall. But he is, I suppose in modern parlance, he's grounded. He's a pragmatist. He knows that, whilst others might claim, to have the moral high ground, he actually has the tools available to actually sort of run the country without letting it crash and burn.
That's absolutely right. He quite liked the historical nature of the British Constitution, British society. He saw no point in pulling all of that down. And when the King's Secretary wrote to this first Labour government and said, it's customary to wear court dress, and I believe that you can hire items of court dress from a firm called Moss Brothers for 25 shillings, MacDonald was quite happy to slip into court breeches and whatnot, and he didn't attach great importance to it, and he thought that his colleagues who refused to compromise by wearing the uniform of the upper classes, he thought they were being rather silly and letting little details get in their way. But he was, similarly, he didn't support the First World War, but he wasn't a pacifist. He preferred to the flabby pietism of pacifism. He thought the First World War was a war that Britain shouldn't have got involved in, but he wasn't an out-and-out pacifist, and he was prepared to, once we went to war, he was prepared to do all he could to help us to win the war.
And so I'm just thinking now, because he after his first term, to go in to lead a government of national emergency or whatever in 31.
31, yeah.
presumably he's the best man for the job. Who's leading the Conservatives at this point, and how do they react to having a Labour man at the helm, as it were?
It's an very odd. The Conservative leader is Stanley Baldwin.
Right.
Baldwin was a profoundly lazy man. Ultimately, he had a spark of ambition, or he wouldn't have been where he was. But he was a very lazy man. He spent most of the year taking the cure in spa towns in Germany and whatnot. So I don't think he didn't mind. MacDonald had been the Prime Minister. Macron was the Prime Minister. And MacDonald and Baldwin wasn't going to depose him. He was quite happy to serve under him and wait his turn. He knew he would ultimately succeed MacDonald. The other ambitious Conservative around at the time was Neville Chamberlain. Quick plug, subject to one of my other books, an interesting man. Yep. He was... he also... And he knew he was going to get to be Prime Minister, so he was prepared to wait for a little bit, and they didn't have to wait for very long. MacDonald spent 3 years at the head of the national government, and then Baldwin had his shot, and then, of course, Chamberlain had his shot. But it's an odd thing, actually. They were very tolerant. I mean, by the time they have a general election after the 1931 government is formed, and by then the Conservative Party is very much the dominant party in the Commons. And they could have swept MacDonald aside, but there was a kind of gentlemanly view that that wouldn't be the thing to do. They still called themselves the national government, so they didn't want to play the party card too obviously. So he was tolerated, and he got on with what he wanted to do, which was mostly to do with foreign policy. And people like Chamberlain did much more on the domestic front. So it worked surprisingly well. Except that his former Labour colleagues, now in opposition, would not speak to him, and he was humiliated and shouted down. And by then his health was failing. He's effectively blacking out in the middle of speeches. He's got severe glaucoma, can't see, all sorts of things. And these last few years for him were very humiliating. He was effectively the prisoner of the Conservatives, and he was a shadow of the great political party man, the platform man. He'd been a wonderful performer on the platform, wonderful speaking, only second perhaps to Lloyd George in terms of the way he could play an audience. So his last years were a sad shadow of the former man.
What was his? I'm just interested in his view on foreign policy, because obviously, being an outsider and being a Scot as well, and that's because the Scots, as the other listeners may know, you could argue the Scots built the British Empire. We've always had engineers, miners, workers, etc. gone out to the far-flung places that the home counties don't want to go to. So what was his foreign policy?
His foreign policy was he had, as I said before, he'd been against the First World War. He knew the German socialists quite well, and he thought he had high hopes that they would stand in the way of a world war. He thought then that Germany was very badly treated in the Versailles settlements that ended the First World War in 1919. And so his foreign policy was initially directed at getting a fairer settlement, and in particular at reducing the antipathy of the French, who were understandably very hostile to Germany, who had invaded them in 1870 and again in 1914. So the French took over, they themselves took over the German Ruhrland after the First World War. They were in occupation of bits of Germany. And MacDonald's great achievement was, at the London Conference of 1929, was to achieve a sort of reconciliation between France on the one hand and Germany on the other, and to pave the way, as he hoped, for a more just and lasting settlement than the Versailles Agreement would create. And indeed, his first serious biographer thought that the London Conference of 1929 was the high point for MacDonald's whole political career, this diplomatic reconciliation. And he continued with that. There was the great problem of the reparation payments that the Germans had to make to the victorious Allies. And he tried to, that of course was a bone of great contention and fueled a great deal of Nazism and the hostility from the German right. He tried to moderate that, but eventually he recognized, as for instance Neville Chamberlain didn't, that Hitler was a force for evil, and he engineered, about the last thing MacDonald did was to engineer an anti-German front at the Streicher Conference in 1934. This might have prevented war in 1939, except that Italy backed out very quickly. It didn't last, but he was a realist. My point there is that he was a realist. He may not have been strong in relation to the First World War, but he was perfectly realistic in relation to Hitler and the threat that he was creating. But the last thing MacDonald did before he left public life was to sign up to the defense estimates in order to start rearming against Germany ahead of the Second World War.
One of the things that strikes me is the fact that he does not fit easily into a political box of that time or in this time. You know, he changes. He's obviously a deep thinker. He's prescient in terms of the Treaty of Versailles and also the way that the French treat the people in the lands they've taken over. I mean, when French troops move into those disputed areas that they've taken over because of the reparations of the war, they act quite viciously, and I'm putting that mildly. So you know, he's I think the thing we underline here is he's a realist, Walter, and for him to be so, as I said before, so viciously written out of the DNA of the labour movement, or indeed the political movements, is because in a world where we now see things in broad brushstrokes, somebody who's got the nuance that he had, MacDonald should be celebrated.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I don't want to sound sycophantic, but that is an insight that I think he's not benefited from. In a way, he was like an older politician of the 19th century who wasn't doctrinaire. They would take contrary positions on different issues depending on what they thought was best. And MacDonald was like that. He was pragmatic. And that perhaps was why he was never was really all that popular with the Labour Party. They recognised him as much the most able Labour politician. But he was against, for instance, he was against militant trade unionism. He was against the general strike of 1936. He wasn't prepared just to follow a theory blindly. He looked at everything on its own merits, and that was a characteristic that was disappearing, and perhaps you could say still has disappeared from the political philosophy of our times. But it is worth remembering the other thing that's forgotten about him is what an incredibly attractive platform figure he was. If you've time, let me just read one thing about description from the book. It's just really to make the point that he was very different from a Keir Starmer. One of his colleagues, who was no fan of his, David Kirkwood, said his head was a thing of beauty. Black hair waved and rolled over a fine brow. His voice was ragged but soft, and as he spoke, there came into it a throb. Standing upright, he was a splendid figure of a man, and his appearance of height and strength was increased by his habit of rising on his toes and throwing back his head. Descriptions, just reading from my book again, descriptions of his platform style at this stage talk of his expressiveness, how he could move from a flowing melody line to the crack of a whip. Others speak about the beauty of his voice and admired its flexibility as it rose from a whisper to the great bass notes of an organ.
You see, that is the thing, Walter. The public speaking, and I mean, apart from that, sounds like complete fanboy fiction. But what I'm saying is, because you have to capture an audience, you can't go on TikTok or get a 30-second clip that you go around social media with a soundbite. You have to argue and debate your case repeatedly, and for that, all the the famous and infamous politicians throughout Europe and indeed, in the States as well, have always been great public speakers.
Well, that's right. As you say, it was effectively before the days of radio, before the days of television, huge mass audiences. And, you asked earlier about his religious background, and I'm sure the sermons that he heard as a boy must have informed the way he spoke. One of his constituencies was in the Welsh valleys at Aberavon, and the people there just took to him naturally because he was part of that kind of Celtic howl, this tradition. And in many ways, a kind of parallel with Lloyd George, whom incidentally he disliked intensely. He regarded Lloyd George as a unserious, unreliable.
You have this figure who is being very Spartan and and obviously hurting deeply from a loss and thinking deeply at a spiritual level. And then there's Lloyd George, who is perhaps a more entertaining, shall we say, figure, Walter.
I think so. I think Lloyd George was a much less serious and sincere man, although also another great platform performer. Yeah. We could do with some of them nowadays, couldn't we?
Well, yeah, the way that you just dropped that thing about Keir Starmer and you go pick and choose. What are you hoping that people will? I mean, what are you hoping? People hopefully will learn and understand. The man himself, the Council Prime Minister.
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate that he is forgotten, because if we don't understand our history, we don't really understand where we are or where we're going to go. So, for our own sake, it's a good thing we should know a bit about MacDonald. But I think just looking back at the man who worked very hard for what he believed in, it is a slight tragedy that he is not now remembered as he deserves to be. But with your listeners listening to every word that we're saying, I'm sure he's going to be rehabilitated overnight.
Now, listeners, go onto our own virtual bookstore. You'll see a picture of a very handsome man with an impressive moustache. That's enough about Walter, but there's a picture of Ramsay MacDonald as well. The council, and you click on the front cover of that, and a well-known distribution service will be winging its way to you. The book is called The Council Prime Minister: The Extraordinary Rise and Tragic Fall of Ramsay MacDonald. It's by the great Walter Reid, who is speaking to today. Walter, do you do social? I mean, I'm not saying you do TikTok yourself, but can people find you on the socials, or is there a website?
Yeah, Facebook and X. Yep, absolutely. Delighted to hear from anyone who's interested, even remotely, in the subject.
Well, listen, Walter. I mean, honestly, I said there's a huge blank space in my history about Ramsay MacDonald, but I'm going to make it up and get hold of a copy of the book because it's absolutely fascinating. The book is called The Council Prime Minister. It's by Walter Reid. Walter, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Charles. It's been great to be with you.